Today we're going to be doing a valve adjustment, fuel filter, and routine maintenance on my Toyota pickup, and here are some of the parts we're going to be installing today. I have a brand new valve cover gasket paired with these nice aluminum half moons from Yota 1 Performance. So the rubber half moons on a 22RE tend to leak, and these are supposed to fix that problem. I have a brand new distributor cap and rotor, oil filter and oil, fuel filter here. These are supposedly pretty hard to change on a 22RE, and I'm hoping that this isn't too challenging for us. Brand new spark plugs and wires. I have a new temperature sender here for the coolant system. Mine's just not working very well, so hopefully this fixes it. New air filter and some RTV for those half moons. I plan to take this truck on a lot of wheeling trips this summer, and I need to make sure that I can get there reliably and, most importantly, still be able to get back home. So I already have the motor warmed up and ready to go, and I'm going to pop this valve cover off and start adjusting the valves. Alright, just popped the valve cover off and everything in here is looking pretty good. It all looks really fresh because the motor was rebuilt a couple thousand miles ago. So now I'm just going to set it to top dead center and start adjusting these valves. I wasn't really planning on making this a how-to video, but I guess I'll just go ahead and explain that part just to add some value to the video for you guys. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is set this motor to top dead center on the compression stroke. And the way you do that is by turning the crank pulley. It's a 19mm socket. It's way down there. You can get to it from the bottom pretty easily. Right there, and you're going to turn that until the rotor under the distributor cap is pointing toward the #1 spark plug. So once I remove the cap, we can see that the rotor is pointing down. So we need to turn the crankshaft until this points towards cylinder 1. Alright, we are now at top dead center on the compression stroke, and we are ready to check and adjust the valves if necessary. The reason why we know we're on top dead center is because the rotor is pointing towards cylinder 1 on the cap. The rocker arms for cylinder 1 are both loose, and the rocker arms for cylinder 4 are both tight. Now, what I mean by that is you'll be able to actually move these. You should feel play when you're moving these around. And you'll also be able to adjust the intake valve on cylinder 2 and the exhaust on cylinder 3. So when you're going through these, cylinder 1 should be loose, cylinder 4 should be tight, and also these valves should be tight as well. Another way to check is by looking down at the crank pulley. Now this will be really hard to show on camera, but the crank pulley has little timing marks and you should be aligned with 0. Alright, so we're going to adjust the valves now. On the exhaust side, we're going to do 0.012 or 12 thousandths, and on the intake, we're going to do 0.008 or 8 thousandths. So all you're going to do is you're going to slide this feeler gauge in between the valve and the rocker arm, and you should get a slight resistance on the feeler gauge when you're pulling it out. It should kind of drag. If it goes in there really loosely or it doesn't fit at all, then you need to adjust the valve. So let's go ahead and test the exhaust on cylinder 1 here. This one's a little loose, and then we'll check. Oh, I lost my gauge. There it is. The intake side feels good on cylinder 1, so we need to adjust the exhaust valve here. And to do that, we're just going to loosen this lock nut, and then we're going to tighten this adjustment nut until everything fits as it should, and then we'll retighten the nut, making sure that the adjuster doesn't turn. Alright, just going to tighten this down to tighten up that clearance, and then check it again. Now it's too tight, so we're just gonna loosen it. Just a lot of trial and error when you're doing this. It's too loose. A little tighter. Alright, so that feels good. So now we're just gonna put the wrench back on it like this, making sure the adjuster doesn't turn. And then we're gonna hold the adjuster the whole time. Actually, I'm gonna do it this way since I don't have a ratcheting wrench. Hold the adjuster in place. Actually tighten the nut instead of hovering over it. And tighten the nut down here while we're holding the adjuster in place. And then once this is tight, we will recheck the clearance one more time. Okay. Yeah, so that one feels good. So now I'm just gonna repeat the same process for the remaining valves, and then I'm gonna spin it one full revolution and then do these valves over here. So as mentioned before, you can do 4 valves at a time. So you can do the 2 on cylinder 1, this one, and this one. So these 3 are all in spec now. This one's a little out of spec, and I just want to show you something. So when the spec here is 12 thousandths, you don't want 13 thousandths to fit. So this is a 13 thousandths gauge here, and as you can see, it goes in here with minimal effort. Actually, it doesn't even have any drag. So, well, add a little bit. So this one's loose and needs to be adjusted. So this is the last one we're gonna adjust here, and then we're gonna move forward and do the remaining 4 valves. So the same process as before, we're just tightening the adjuster to tighten that clearance, and then we'll just keep checking it until the 12 thousandths fits and the 13 thousandths doesn't. So 12 thousandths isn't fitting, we're too tight right now. Just gonna loosen it up a little bit. All right, 12 thousandths has a slight drag to it, and 13 thousandths also fits, so it's too loose still. Tighten it up just a little bit. All right, that feels perfect there. I would be shocked if 13 thousandths still fits. And it does not. So now we just have to tighten up that lock nut, and then we'll be good here. All right, check it one more time. 12 thousandths fits in there. 13 thousandths does not. All right, now that these valves are adjusted, we need to rotate the engine one full revolution, and we'll be able to adjust the remaining valves. So same thing as last time, we're just gonna grab the ratchet and turn the crank by hand until this points the complete opposite direction, that way. The valves are done. A couple of them were out of spec. I'm not too surprised. That's pretty common with new engines. After a couple thousand miles, you're gonna have to readjust the valves. So I adjusted a couple of exhaust valves, and the intake valve on cylinder 4 was kind of tight. But other than that, everything else was good. As you guys saw, it's not that hard of a process. You just need a feeler gauge. Honestly, that's the only tool you truly need, and a 12mm wrench. So just to recap everything, we first set it to top dead center. This rotor was pointing towards cylinder 1. We were able to adjust the cylinder 1 valves, as well as this guy and this guy, and then we rotated it 360 degrees until it was pointing towards cylinder 4, and then we're able to adjust the valves on cylinder 4, as well as this guy and this guy. After you make all your adjustments and everything, you just tighten everything back up and put the valve cover back on, which is what we're going to do now. Also, I'll include the guide that I follow when I adjust valves on 22REs in the description below. It's from a company called LC Engineering. They primarily build Toyotas. They know their stuff. So I was cleaning up the gasket surface and getting those little half moons ready to install when I noticed that the coolant temperature sensor is all the way down here, and it's going to be easier to replace that when the valve cover is off. So I'm going to go ahead and replace this first and then install the valve cover. And by the way, thanks Timmy the Toolman for informing me that I don't need any Teflon tape on here. So I'm going to install this dry. And the coolant temp sender is installed. That was pretty easy. Alright, I got the new gasket on the valve cover and the Yoda 1/2 moons are installed. The one on the rear, I kind of had to grind it a little bit. It's a little tall, but I think it should seal. So I'm going to go ahead and put this on now. Oh, I also got the valve cover all clean too. So just maneuver this thing into there. It's kind of a pain to fight to get this thing in. Oh, much easier than taking it off. All right. Cool. Another thing that I noticed is, yes, I know I look ridiculous with the GoPro on my head, but another thing, when I was working through this, I noticed that these studs on the valve cover were loose. So I had to use like the double nut method, basically you tighten a nut on a nut, so you can tighten this like a bolt to get all these nice and secure, because every single one in there was loose. But yeah, just gonna go ahead and get the rest of the valve cover all put together now, and all the stuff that goes on top of it, get that back on too, and then we can finally move forward with this maintenance. Well, this is what I get for trying to be proactive. When I tightened those down and made them secure, it tightened them in too far. And now I don't have enough thread to tighten the valve cover nut on, so I'm gonna loosen them up a little bit. And it's a little bit of an odd design to me to purposely have a stud that's not tight, but I guess I understand it's like somewhat adjustable in a way, so I'm just gonna loosen this a little bit so I can tighten the nut down. All right, the valve cover's back on, and I don't think I missed any vacuum lines, but if I did, I'll know when I turn the truck on. Now we can move forward to the ignition system and pick up some low-hanging fruit, really easy stuff. Rotor and cap, spark plugs and wires. Let's start with the rotor. That was pretty easy, wasn't it? Put the new rotor on. There we go. Now we're gonna do the cap. Cap and rotor are installed. Now we're going to move on to the spark plugs. Normally I do one at a time, but since we know the firing order, I'm just going to do everything all at once. Oh, nice. That's always pleasant. Let's just go ahead and get all of these old wires out and then get those new NGKs in. Just got the old spark plugs out and they're all burning the exact same, which is good. I don't see any issues with the way that these cylinders are firing. Also, well, not every single, but 2 of the 4 spark plug wires I took out lost the inside of the wire. I know I was tugging it by the wire, but still, they shouldn't just come out. So happy to be replacing those with some NGKs. I just checked the gap on the new plugs and they seem to be pre-gapped. Everything looks good to go. Just gonna toss some anti-seize on the threads, install the spark plugs, and then put in those new wires. With the valve adjustment, distributor cap, rotor, plugs, and wires done, now I'm gonna move on to the air filter, oil change, and fuel filter. I'm gonna start with the easiest thing first, and I'm gonna start working on the air filter here, then I'm gonna move to the oil change, and then finally finish the fuel filter. This thing's actually pretty clean. I probably didn't even have to replace it. I'm taking the tire off now because when I was trying to get the oil filter off, I wasn't able to get it off by hand and I can't find my oil filter wrench. So I'm gonna have to stop by the store and pick up another one, but in order to get to the fuel filter, it looks like the tire has to come off just to make more room. So I'm gonna do the fuel filter first, and then once that's done, I'll go ahead and finish up the oil change. Right above the starter, you can barely see it. I can't even get the camera to focus on it, but the fuel filter is right there. It's above the starter and under the intake manifold. You can see we have a fuel line there and a fuel line over here, and then there's a mount on top and a mount on bottom right above the starter right there. You could just barely see the tab for the mount. So we're gonna need a swivel and a couple of long extensions to get to this thing. You can see the mount a little bit better on this new fuel filter here. So you see the tab on top and the tab on bottom, and both of them are kind of tucked behind things. So we're gonna need to use some sorcery to get that thing out of there. All right, I was just able to pop off the banjo bolts. I have this one loose and I have that one all the way off. Be prepared to catch a lot of fuel that's gonna come out of this thing. It's a 17 millimeter for both banjo bolts, and there's gonna be some copper washers in there that are gonna come with your new fuel filter too. So far this is going pretty easy. The mounts, I haven't tried to get to them yet, but this one looks really easy to get to. The one on top might be a problem. But yeah, I think this is gonna go pretty smooth. Here's how I'm gonna take off that bottom mount. It's pretty straightforward, just using the long extension. I don't even think I would need to use a swivel here. I have one on there, but I don't think I'd have to use it. Anyway, just gonna loosen this bottom mount now. Try to do it with one hand. There we go. So now I'm just gonna loosen this bottom mount out of here. The ratchet fell off, but the bolt's loose. And then I have to go work on that top mount. By the way, they're 12 millimeter bolts that hold the fuel filter onto the block. So there's the top mounting bolt for the fuel filter. It looks pretty intimidating to get to it on camera, but in person it's actually really easy to get to. I was able to get to it from the same direction that I got the bottom bolt from. Just used a couple extensions and a swivel. So I'm just gonna loosen that and then remove the fuel filter. The fuel filter's out. Here's the old one next to the new one. It wasn't that hard to remove. It was actually pretty easy. It's definitely harder than other cars to take this thing out, but it wasn't that difficult if you just have a couple of extensions and a swivel. Sorry, the wind's going crazy over here. So we're gonna use the same mounting bolts to mount it back up, of course. We're gonna use the same banjo bolts, but we're gonna use new washers. So I'm gonna go ahead and install this new fuel filter now. Also, I almost forgot, the filter goes in this way. Got the new filter in there. Now I just have to hook up the fuel lines. All right, the fuel filter is installed with the banjo bolts, new washers, and it's tightened up to the block. Now I just have to hook the battery back up and see if this thing leaks. I probably should have mentioned earlier that I took off the negative battery cable before I even started on this, and that's because the fuel filter is really close to the starter, and I could imagine myself grounding the starter out, sending a bunch of sparks into the fuel that's leaking out of that filter, and then catching the whole truck on fire. So I'm just hooking up the negative battery cable now. I'm gonna start the truck and see if I have any leaks at those fuel lines. All right, the truck is running and I'm not seeing any leaks. I've been looking at these banjo fittings for a while now and I don't see any gas coming out of them from either the inlet or the outlet, so I think we're probably good to go. That honestly wasn't that hard to install. It's just kind of annoying, but other than that, it's easier than other things that I've done on this truck. So with that said, I still need to do the oil change to complete my maintenance here. But as I mentioned before, I'm not able to get the oil filter off, so I need to stop by the auto parts store and pick up an oil filter wrench, and then we can get started on the oil change. I just got to the auto parts store and check it out. My temperature gauge works again. So it actually was just the sensor. Also, there's a sweet new Bronco in the parking lot with a hard top. I've been eyeing these things for a while, I just haven't picked one up yet. Just got back home from the auto parts store, and here is the wrench that I ended up getting. The typical style ones are all out of stock, so this is all they had. I'm tempted to just crack the filter loose before I even drain the oil, just to make sure that I can actually get the oil filter off before this thing has no oil in it. So that's what I'm gonna do first. All right, yeah, it's coming off. So I don't want to loosen it entirely because I don't want it to leak everywhere, but it looks like we're gonna be able to get that thing off of there. So I'm gonna go ahead and drain the oil now. Well, that was a disaster. Well, now that I made the biggest mess in the world, we can move on and change the oil filter out. I was trying to hold it up above the diff because I didn't want the diff to get dirty. Instead, I just ruined the concrete on the side of my house. So, yeah, that's cool. Big mistake on my part, but I'm sure it'll be funny to watch. So yeah, just gonna change the oil filter now, and then we should be done with the oil. Got the old filter off. I'm still over here laughing at my oil spill. I can't believe I did that. All right, gonna put the new filter on now and then put some oil in this thing and we should be done. All right, the oil change is done. Just gonna start the truck up now and make sure that we get oil pressure. And it looks like we're good. Oil pressure is climbing. So after the motor runs for a little bit, I'm gonna check the oil again, but I don't think I need to show that on camera. So with that said, that's gonna wrap up this video. If this was helpful for you guys, or you just enjoyed the content, or you liked watching me make a fool of myself and spill all this oil, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Later.
Here we go, at the top.